Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the second webinar to be organized by the Asia Protected Area Partnership. My name is Min-sun Kim, and I'm working as Protected Areas Program Officer in the IUCN Asia Regional Office. Before we start the main part of the program, I'd like to give you a brief introduction to today's webinar, as well as Asia Protected Area Partnership, in short, APAP. APAP is an informal regional platform for government, protected areas, agencies, and other stakeholders. And IUCN Asia Regional Office is currently serving as the secretariat of the partnership. The ongoing COVID-19 has affected all aspects of society, and protected areas are no exception. During post-COVID-19 era, we could see clearly that sharing best practices to respond to the pandemic is very important to make the future better. This is the overview of the webinar today. And the aim of the second APAP webinar is to understand the impact of COVID-19 on PA management, and share experiences addressing the crisis in Asia, and discuss the future challenges and opportunity in the post-COVID-19 era. I am delighted that Dr. Mark Hawkins has offered to be our first key speaker. Dr. Mark Hawkins is Emeritus Professor, School of Earth and Environmental Sciences in the University of Queensland. He will give a presentation on COVID-19 and protected conserved areas, global snapshot, emerging scenarios, and a call for action. The presentation was prepared together with Ms. Mariana Napolitano Ferreira, who is serving as the co-chair of IUCN WCPA Task Force on COVID-19 and Protected and Conserved Areas. She is based in Brazil, and it is now 4 a.m. there. Due to this time difference, she recorded a short video in advance for delivering message to webinar participants. Her video will be played after Dr. Mark Hawkins' presentation. I'm also delighted to introduce two important speakers from Park Agency in Asia, who will share their experiences to respond to COVID-19. Mr. Hee-jin Kang, Chief Program Officer from Korea National Park Service, will present the case of Korea National Parks. And Mr. Rudy Apin, Deputy Director of Sabah Parks, will present the case of Sabah Parks. So after each presentation, we will have a question and answer session, facilitated by Mr. Alex McWilliam, Program Coordinator in the IUCN Asia Regional Office. If you'd like to raise any questions or leave comments, then please post these in the chat room on your right side, and then Alex will select key points for discussion. And I would like to request all participants turn off your microphones and videos during the webinar. Lastly, I'd like to share that this webinar will be recorded. After the webinar, we will share the link to the video of all speakers. With the brief introduction and overview, I'd like to thank you again for joining the webinar. I hope you will find it useful and informative. Now, I will hand over to Dr. Mark Hawkins to give his presentation.
Thank you for the invitation. I hope that you can all see the screen. This presentation comes out of some work that we did within the World Commission on Protected Areas, looking at the impact of COVID-19 on protected and conserved areas. This was done as an editorial essay in the IUCN journal Parks that was published at the beginning of June this year. As you can see, a large group of authors involved, not only from IUCN, WCPA, from many of the leading international NGOs, WWF, WCS, CI, and so on, and also a number from people from agencies, and people such as Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, the new chair of the GEF, were all authors on this paper. We started with the idea of just wanting to document what we knew about the impacts of protected areas. Very early in the pandemic, we thought it would be important to understand what those changes were, but it very quickly became apparent that we should try to do a lot more than that, that this was going to be a major challenge for protected areas, and that we should try and respond to the implications of COVID-19 on protected areas. And there was a real enthusiasm to build a broad coalition right across the protected area community. And that's why we reached out to authors from all of those sectors. And with the idea of developing a call for action, a basis for us to go forward. So the editorial essay really provided the background to that call for action, and I'll cover some of the material that we included in that paper. The first thing is to set the context to understand the relationship between pandemics such as COVID-19 and zoonotic diseases. We know that almost 70% of emerging zoonotic diseases come from wildlife, and about half of the spillover events are driven by poor land use, by land use change and associated activities. So it's our impact on the environment that actually exposes us to these sorts of spillover events and pandemics. And the large-scale conversion of natural ecosystems is what's driving that. So well-designed and well-managed networks of protected areas can help us to prevent these sorts of spillover events, to maintain intact natural habitat, to reduce the stress on wildlife so these spillovers don't occur. But it also has implications for the future. So when we're designing protected areas, particularly when we look at those parts of protected areas where we have intensive land use close to areas important for wildlife, we ought to be managing those boundary areas very carefully to prevent spillover events. And in designing protected areas, we should in future think about the dynamics of disease events and try and design our protected areas to limit the chance of such events happening. When we looked at the impacts, it's relatively early and things are still evolving. We're learning more each day. But clearly the biggest impact was the economic impact that came from the collapse of the tourist industry. So a significant loss of income for protected and conserved areas and the communities in and around those. That meant reduced revenue and budgets for park agencies. It was particularly severe for conservancies and community-based conservation areas. And we know from previous work of the World Tourism Council that it takes around 19 months for economic recovery to happen after a disease event. When we look at the pre-COVID situation from some estimates that were done and published in the last 18 months, an estimate of about 8 billion visits to protected areas each year through tourism. And that's responsible for about $600 billion in direct expenditure from tourists. There's been some survey work being done on the impact on conserved areas. And this is from a survey of African protected areas. And you can see about 90% of protected areas agencies were suffering medium to high impacts on their revenue because of the impact of COVID-19. And private, as I said, private conservancies are particularly hard hit. These are some photos from Kenya, from the Mara Naboshu Conservancy at the Masai Mara. That conservancy, a private conservancy, provided the main income for more than 600 families living in that area, and that has ceased completely. The community rangers are no longer employed. They're not able to undertake work on the reserve. So that's just one example. In the bottom photo here, you can see the community members making handicraft. Again, that was a major source of income that's been lost. The direct ecological impacts are harder to assess. We know that there is a high risk for non-human primates from COVID-19. We know that Ebola was responsible for the death of more than 3,000 gorillas in just one area in Africa. It's likely that non-human primates would also be susceptible to COVID-19. So particular attention has to be paid to managing those areas. There's some anecdotal evidence of a positive, but probably a temporary benefit because of reduced human activity in protected and conserved areas, but relatively little information available on that. And it's likely to be temporary. Once the tourism restarts, I think things would return very quickly to the previous situation. Management and enforcement impacts, another big area, but quite variable. When we looked around the world at what information was available, there's certainly reduced staff activity and a reduction in a number of major management services, including patrols, restoration work, monitoring, and so on. It seems quite a variable picture in terms of things like control over illegal activity. So in some places, there's been a spike in poaching or illegal resource extraction. But in other places where data is available, for example, from the Kruger National Park in Africa, it seems that it's actually produced a reduction in poaching activity, perhaps because the poachers have greater trouble, because of reduced international travel in terms of moving the poached material around. A lot more to be learnt here, and I'll talk a little later about some of the work that's being done to better understand these impacts on management. In terms of visitation, many protected areas are either partially or completely closed to visitation. Where protected areas have remained open, particularly close to urban areas, there's an increased visitor pressure. So a lot of people are going to nature when they can't move around for health benefits, for recreation, for their mental well-being. One of the things that they looked at World Natural Heritage Sites, about 72% of countries have closed their World Heritage Sites. There's certainly reduced resources for things like fire management, managing human-wildlife conflict, and research and monitoring and restoration activities. For example, in Australia, the work that we need to recover from those disastrous summer bushfires has stopped because of restrictions in many places. Another big area of impact is the impact on communities, on the social impacts on people living in and around protected areas. Indigenous communities are highly vulnerable to the impacts of COVID, so there's big concern around that. But there's certainly reduced incomes and livelihoods, and that may actually drive resource exploitation, where people, having lost the income from tourism, are looking to support their livelihoods from the extraction of resources from protected and conserved areas. And then there are policy challenges in terms of what are the priorities of government. Governments are spending money like they've never done before to try and support communities. The question is, where will that go? Will it be reallocated from environmental management to other priorities? And there's also some evidence of rollbacks of conservation and management of conserved areas as countries try to get economies restarted and re-energized. So lots of different areas. Information is really just appearing on many of these now. We looked at in the paper 3 scenarios, what might happen after COVID-19. So one is that we just flip back to where we were before. So if we get a vaccine, and let's hope we do soon, but that in response to that, we go back to old patterns of production and consumption, and the environmental and social challenges that we have remain unaddressed. What it means is that 2030, which was meant to be a major year for biodiversity, essentially is delayed. and the underfunding of protected and conserved areas remains. So we end up worse off. The dire scenario is that we get a longer lasting recession, that tourism remains depressed, that countries prioritise economic growth at any cost, and that leads them to rolling back environmental regulations and reallocating money away from conservation. And what we see is actually a decline in environmental conservation, and also a greater risk of future endemics and pandemics. And the hopeful scenario, and this is what we really need the call for action to push us towards, is that we actually use this crisis to change our relationship with nature, that people recognise the importance of intact nature in preventing future pandemics, that they recognise the role of environmental conservation and protected areas in helping to rebuild economies, and that we move forward for a green recovery rather than the scenario 2. So we looked at those as possible scenarios, and then we used that to develop a call for action. To firstly recognise that COVID-19 is a symptom of a wider environmental crisis, and that part of our response to that should be a commitment to achieve a more healthy and sustainable planet, and that protected and conserved areas are one of the ways in which we can do that, but we need to recognise that they're currently under severe stress because of those impacts that I discussed before. And the call for action consists of 3 strategies. Firstly, to rescue protected areas, to maintain and invest in the essential services to keep protected areas functional and protected. To draw up and implement emergency plans for how we're going to manage these areas under the scenarios faced in different countries. To provide emergency funding to support protected areas that have lost resources, to make sure that we keep monitoring going and maintain existing laws and prevent the rollback of conservation. Secondly, that we recover over time, that we promote the health benefits of protected and conserved areas, and build protected areas into and health considerations into the recovery plans for protected areas, and create a foundation for more sustainable financing. What this has really done is shown how exposed we are to conservation depending upon tourism for financing. We need a better capacity to finance conservation from other sources. And then thirdly, we need to rebuild more strongly to help avoid a new pandemic, to address the high-risk wildlife trade, to promote rights-based approaches and innovative funding, and to strengthen the network. So that's where the work of this task force that we're setting up will be based around trying to put this call for action into place. So this paper has received lots of attention. This is just from the website of the journal, more than 3,000 downloads since it was published. And on ResearchGate, which tracks research interest, this paper's in the top 1% of papers published this year, and in the top 8% of papers on the ResearchGate platform over all time. So getting a lot of attention. COVID is generating attention, and we need to use that to produce the results that we want. There are some positive signs. Pakistan has announced a Protected Areas Initiative with 15 new national parks covering over 7,000 square kilometres, 5,000 jobs, and a commitment to list 7 of those sites with the IUCN Green List as part of their COVID recovery plan. And in New Zealand, they've committed $1.1 billion as part of COVID recovery to create 11,000 jobs to address invasive species, to enhance biodiversity conservation. So these are some prime examples of countries using conservation as part of their recovery strategy. We've set up a task force to address that. It's chaired by Mariana Ferreira and Rachel Golden-Kroner. It's going to continue the work that we started in the editorial essay with an aim to move this towards the longer term, a positive scenario that we promoted. And we're going to publish a special issue of Parks to carry this work forward. So it was very preliminary work in the editorial essay, but our aim is to have this published in time for the World Conservation Congress. So we know we're all facing a huge challenge. What's important is that we make this challenge work for conservation rather than against conservation. So thank you very much. And I think we now have a short video from Mariana about the task force. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. First of all, I'd like to congratulate the Asia Protected Area Partnership for organizing this important debate, and thank you for inviting myself and Mark to join you. As you probably talked a lot today, the COVID and pandemic is an acute health crisis with economic, political, social, and environmental implications. And these factors are already impacting protected and conserved areas worldwide. And we expect, unfortunately, that these impacts will grow both in the short and in the longer term. WCPA needs to respond to this situation by providing advice, coordination, and leadership. And we've been working with partners to draft the call for action, which is part of the recent paper published in Parks. And this call for action is, of course, not intended as a final project, but actually a working document to create discussion and feedback, both within WCPA and with the wider protected area community. It invites responses from governments and includes a commitment from the WCPA. This commitment will be implemented by the task force, which I'm currently co-chairing. And so the major objective of the task force is the implementation of the call for action. And of course that the details and activities will probably change over time, since the pandemic is creating a very rapidly evolving situation. Anyway, initial elements of the task force includes organizing information of the impact and sharing this information, coordinating with other areas of WCPA, other IUCN commissions, and responses to pandemic to ensure protected areas are part of them, develop principles and good practices for protected and conserved areas to deal with zoonoses across the 3 phases of the pandemic: relief, recover, and rebuild, provide technical information through briefings on how to make the case for the role of protected areas in One Health approach, in green stimulus packages, and engage WCPA members in an ongoing dialogue on the impacts and responses to the pandemic, and of course, showcase, share, disseminate good solutions that are already happening in some of the places. And finally, we will assist IUCN in relation to the upcoming international events on this agenda, especially during the World Conservation Congress, CBD COP, and the UNFCCC COP. The engagement of members of the Asia Protected Area Partnership, as well as IUCN WCP members in Asia, will be fundamental to make this call for action a reality. We are now just in the process of establishing the task force, and we are looking for volunteers in each of the regions to help us carry this work. I think this is what I wanted to say to you today. And I hope you had a very good debate, and please don't hesitate to reach me if you want to discuss this specific topic. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Mark, and also to Mariana for that intervention. Everyone, my name is Alex McWilliam. I am the program coordinator here at the Natural Resources Group at IUCN Asia, and I will be facilitating the question and answer session. We have around 20 minutes for the first question and answer session. And we have a couple of questions already coming in on the chat. And I believe Mark, and please everyone, turn on the chat in your Zoom interface there so you can see the questions coming in also. There was a question about job creation in New Zealand, and Mark, you mentioned that there were some 11,000 jobs created during COVID-19 in protected areas related employment in New Zealand, and you already clarified that a lot of those jobs were related to invasive species management and also ecological restoration. There is a question from one of our colleagues regarding rapid technical support available to support emergency rescue of protected areas. I presume that means in terms of responses, recovery responses during and immediately following this COVID-19 period. Mark, if I could turn to you, are you aware of any emergency response mechanisms that governments have in place for protected areas in this region or globally?
Certainly globally, I can answer that. But before I go to that, I might just clarify that the New Zealand rescue package was an announcement by government of intent and a commitment of 1.1 billion. I'm not sure how many of those 11,000 jobs have already been created. I think that's their plan, to create that over a number of years. But they're certainly using, and they announced that as specifically as a response to COVID-19, that this was an area where they could employ people to do this work that would generate long-term environmental benefits as well as employment, given the spike in unemployment. And I think that's one area, because countries want to address the sharp rise in unemployment and jobs that won't come back perhaps for a while, that this is one area where they can work. To go to the second question that you raised then in terms of rapid response, there are some I'm aware of, but not in Asia. So IUCN and through its BioPharma program, which is a European Union funded program for supporting protected areas in Africa, Oceania and the Caribbean, they have a rapid action grant program, about 2 million euros to support up to 60 projects specifically to address the emergency needs of protected areas in response to COVID. And the other one I'm aware of is through another IUCN program, the Save Our Species program. And they also have a rapid action grant program for Africa to address species conservation needs. Asia, but that doesn't mean it's not there. But that's one of the things that the task force will try and track. So it would be good to hear from others if they know of any such programs.
That's great, Mark. Thanks, Mark, for that response. I would also point out that I would also add to that I think it's up to all of us to advocate with our national governments that recovery of protected areas, as you mentioned during your presentation, Mark, is something that needs to be advocated by all of us to our national governments and within the international community of concern as well. There's a question here, Mark, about standard operating procedure or a series of guidelines that might be available for protected areas as they look to reopen, parks and trails following the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm aware that perhaps the task force is working on that. Can you tell us some more about it?
I know of some individual examples. So here in Australia, where park agencies are putting in place some of those procedures for their staff, and in terms of social distancing and how they're going to manage that. In Africa, I'm aware in Rwanda and Uganda and places where they have gorillas, they've closed those parks to visitation, and they have strict protocols around staff movement. I'm not aware of any general development of standard operating procedures, but I'm happy to raise that with the task force, and it may well be something that they could work on. I notice in the chat box that in Sarawak they have implemented some, so it would be great if those could be shared with the task force, and I will raise that with Mariana as a task that they might look at.
Absolutely, and it's my understanding, and sorry about my mention there, Mark, and regarding the task force specifically on protected areas and COVID-19. However, I understand that the WCPA Urban Conservation Strategy Specialist Group is working on a series of guidelines or best practice for reopening parks and trails after the COVID-19 period, and perhaps that will be published sometime in the near future.
Yeah, that sounds good. There's lots of connections to be made, and one of the things I'd say is Mariana, invited people to contact her, and I'll provide an email address to you after that. But the task force is only just being established now; it's just getting going, and we'll be looking for members. So if people are interested in this and members of the Commission or would like to become members of the Commission and participate, please let us know, and that would be really welcome. We want to make sure that the task force has got broad regional representation and that we're capturing things like the Sarawak example with the standard operational procedures.
Mark, if I could turn to another question in the chat now about from a colleague, Mr. or Mr. Pasha, I believe. How can we raise the profile of protected and conserved areas to ensure that governments continue to invest in these areas and also build capacity to manage them effectively? What are your thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think we really need to get the message out about the link between intact ecosystems, ecological integrity, and the prevention of these sorts of spillover events. So I think the world is going to be paying a lot of attention to the issue of health and pandemics, and the link is very well established in science, but not well understood. So the One Health approach, I think, is a key message to send there. Getting that out into the right fora is important. I know just a couple of days ago, the IUCN President Jincheng Zhang from China gave a presentation to a high-level segment of the United Nations ECOSOC, Economic and Social Council, on just this issue. And that event included the Secretary General of the United Nations. I think getting that message out to bodies like that, making the connections to things like World Health Organization. We really need to, we've got something that should be of interest to people that are concerned about preventing these pandemics in the future, and we've got to make the case about the importance of that. So I think we want to use all of the avenues that we have available to make sure that people understand that.
Yes, thanks again, Mark. I mean, there is another comment in the chat regarding the guidelines or the best practice for reopening parks and conserved areas, protected and conserved areas after the COVID-19 pandemic, and that could happen sometime in the near future. And so it would be great to have those guidelines out. We can certainly follow up after this to see what the status is of the development of such guidelines by specialist groups within the commissions of IUCN, so that we can certainly do. However, for colleagues on the webinar, we will have a couple of case studies from colleagues in Korea and also in Malaysia, in Sarawak, coming up shortly. And perhaps in those you can take note of some of the practices that they are putting in for reopening of parks. Mark, if I could turn to a question from, I believe it's from Myanmar, if I may. If the financial investment reduces if the financial investment is reduced in conservation around the world, does it encourage leading to loan programs for increasing protected area management activities? Should we be looking more at loan programs for investment in protected area management?
Yeah, I think this is going to be one of the areas where we need to do a lot more work, and there is interest in this. It'll be one of the papers in the special issue of Parks looking at this whole question of the reliance, the heavy reliance on tourism to fund conservation in many parts of the world. It's not universal. There are places which don't depend on tourism, but you know, in many parts of the world, both developed and developing, you know, in Africa, but also in Australia and many places, it's the model that has supported it, and this has shown how fragile it is. And I don't think that the importance of it will diminish. I think what we need to do is build a more diverse and a more resilient system for funding, and that may include loan funding and others. This is not my area of expertise, but there are people who work on innovative and sustainable financing, and I think we've got a real job for them to do now, to have a look at this and to think about, you know, what are the options and how might they work. Are there things that can be done to think about the emergency response? So what happens, you know, if we go back? I don't think we want to give up the tourism, you know, dollars. I think that they clearly are a major source of revenue to support conservation. It's important that we get people to contribute in that way, but there's a problem if we rely just on that. So.
Yeah, certainly. It's a question that I also had, Mark, as I noted during your presentation. What are those other capacities to sustainably finance protected areas in these times of crisis, where tourism and those protected and conserved areas that rely heavily on tourism and those communities within and around them, you know, what are those other mechanisms? And turning to loans, there are, of course, many mechanisms to fund protected areas that also come from the private sector as well, through different financing mechanisms. However, some of those might rely on flow in those private sector industries, and so maybe also affected a kind of upstream effect for protected area financing. So yes, I don't have the answers also, but you know, certainly there is a need to think about safety net mechanisms for financing of protected area operations, and ways to perhaps replace short-term incomes for communities that rely on tourism in protected areas in such times. Turning to that, just briefly, we had some questions come in during just prior to the webinar via our email, and one of them relates to PCAs, or protected and conserved areas, and communities. And for those that are heavily dependent on tourism, are there any ways or mechanisms that you're aware of already, Mark, that, say for example, in Kenya or in the Maasai or in other areas, what are the mechanisms that they're using to assist communities during this time that rely heavily on local tourism? Do you know of any?
So that example that I gave of the Mara, the Naboishu Conservancy, which is a private community, well, it's a community conservancy, but they work very closely with tourism operators from Europe to support that. What they've done is turn initially to philanthropy, so to run a public appeal to make it clear that the dire impact of this on the community. But they've struggled, so they've got, you know, they've raised a few $100,000 when they need hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the long-term trajectory of that, I'm not sure. I think in a lot of ways, private conservancies are probably more exposed than government. from the evidence that we collected in preparing the paper, it seemed that the impact was greatest there. And the danger there is that if communities lose that income, then some of the incentive for conservation will be lost. So I think that's an area that we need to pay more attention to. I think part of the thing is a bit like the New Zealand example, and to some extent in Pakistan, is convincing governments that a green recovery will produce, dual benefits. It not only will support conservation, but it's a way to support communities in this emergency period to recover, to create employment quickly, but employment that actually generates a long-term environmental benefit for the country. So that, I guess, doing work around that, showing the examples, tracking what's happening could be one of the ways in which we could do that. Some communities, of course, that don't rely on tourism, they really just need protection, and they'll continue their conserving for their intrinsic reasons and motivations, and we should support those.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks. We have time just for one more question. I'd like to turn back to some of the questions that we received via email prior to the webinar, and that is about are there any kind of state or region-wide databases or systems of data collection to quantify the impacts of COVID-19 on protected and conserved areas or ecosystem services, for that matter? Just to add from my perspective, I'm not aware of any systematic data collection that is going on across a region like Asia, for example, on effects of COVID-19 on protected and conserved areas or ecosystem services. I'm aware that in Pakistan, since it's already been mentioned, is a country that is undertaking a program to look at the impacts of COVID-19 on delivery of ecosystem services and on biodiversity. And that's something that IUCN is working on with the government of Pakistan, or hopes to, in the near future. But Mark, from your perspective, are you aware of anything in that nature? There've been a number of surveys being done. I don't know of any databases that are being put together, but there are surveys being run by IUCN and partners in Oceania through the BioPharma program. In Africa, that's already been completed and the report published. In the Caribbean, South America, and I understand IUCN Asia office also is doing that. There's one starting in Australia. So there are many surveys, and one of the jobs of the task force will be to pull all of that information together. I don't know of a database that's actually collecting that information and putting it into any systematic way, but again, that may be something that the task force takes on. There's a lot of activity. There are more papers coming out all the time on COVID-19 and increasingly on that and conservation. So exactly where that's going to go, I'm not sure. But as I said, it's early days and things are still getting organised. Great. Thanks, Mark. Once again, I'd like to thank Dr. Mark Hocking, Emeritus Professor at the University of Queensland, for his presentation and for delivering some responses during this question and answer session. Now we will move on to the next portion of the webinar, which is a presentation from Mr. Hee-Jin Kang, Chief Program Officer at the Korean National Park Service, and he will provide us with a case study from Asia, and specifically, obviously, from the Republic of Korea. Mr. Hee-Jin Kang, the webinar is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As introduced by Min Sun, I'm Hee-Jin Kang, Chief Program Officer of the Korean National Park Service. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to share the KMPS experiences to respond to COVID-19 at this meaningful webinar. I hope the experiences in Korea will help you manage your protected areas. As shown by this slide, I present the overview of KMPS and Korea's response to COVID-19, followed by response activities of KMPS and post-COVID-19 plans. There are over 3,400 protected areas in Korea, which are managed by several institutions, respectively. KMPS is a government agency to manage national parks under the Ministry of Environment. There are 22 national parks in Korea, accounting for 6.6% of its total territory. Based on the headquarters, KMPS has 29 regional offices and 1 research institute, and so on. The budget amounts to $330 million and about 2,500 staff in KMPS. As you can see in this slide, more than 43 million people visit national parks every year, which means 8 out of 10 Koreans visit national parks annually. As you can see in this picture, many people visit national parks on holidays. Understanding the unique culture of Korean visitors, KMPS has established and implemented policies to fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. This is current status of COVID-19 in the world. This slide compares the global trend and Korean trend. As you can see on the right, after viewers testing and tracing, the number of new daily confirmed cases peaked in late February and has steadily declined. Since mid-March, the daily recovered cases have significantly surpassed the new confirmed cases, reducing the number of patients in treatment. Now let me present how KMPS has responded to COVID-19 in terms of protected areas management. KMPS controlled and closed only public facilities used by the crowds, such as camping sites and shelters, for a certain period in the early days of the pandemic, but allowed the public to visit the national parks after the outbreak of COVID-19. Such experiences in KMPS were divided into 6 parts. First, CEO leadership. As the response level rose from alert to serious, high-level managers of KMPS headquarters immediately convened a meeting to judge the situation comprehensively and discuss measures for park management. What's discussed here has been reflected as the basis for each department to establish its in-depth measures to respond to COVID-19. What's the most important in case of COVID-19 responses was staff safety. As soon as COVID-19 broke out, KMPS developed various measures, regulations, and guidelines for each staff to create a safe working environment for staffs. In particular, for staff safety, KMPS has ordered a single entrance, installed thermometers to check body temperature of staff, and strengthened disinfection in elevators. After the response level was upgraded to serious, staffs of each department were grouped to shift to work at home, reducing office capacity. To reinforce staff safety, various measures were carried out. For example, flexible lunchtime, eating meals sitting on site, on-take meeting, and prohibition of business trips. As a result, all employees worked normally, but no one was infected by the virus. Next is visitor management. As shown by this slide, the annual visitors decreased, but still many people visit national parks. In case of national parks located in urban areas, the visitors rather increase. For the safety of visitors, we operate a control room 24/7. In addition, KMPS controlled public facilities used by crowds such as nature centers and visitor centers. Of course, in-person services for visitors were suspended, especially we conducted 2 mirror distancing campaigns at 170 entrances to main trails. This slide shows you various activities for digital safety, including 2 mirror distancing campaigns and checking body temperature of visitors, and so on. KMPS has promoted on-tech digital programs to provide psychological stability and feeling of healing to people tired of the infectious virus. KMPS has developed services that utilize social media, such as YouTube and Kakao, and has implemented on-tech programs of environmental education by providing interpretation videos of national parks to educational institutions. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a direct impact on the community and the residents of the park. To contribute to preventing the spread of the virus and establishing a safety net for the community, KMPS conducted social contribution activities such as donating special funds and supporting emergency necessities. In addition, KMPS staff worked with volunteers to help residents suffering from shortage of workers. To revitalize the local economy, we ran drive-through farmers markets. Additionally, we provided relief and hygiene products to residents who were struggling to respond to the pandemic. Coupled with COVID-19 responses, post-COVID-19 plans are also an important issue. KMPS has been running the task force team to establish a park management plan to proactively respond to rapid social changes caused by COVID-19. The pandemic triggered plenty of changes in staff education policies. KMPS has established a training plan according to the level of COVID-19 and expanded online training. We carried out various events to contain COVID-19 and opened the PR content hub to introduce KMPS activities. Furthermore, we provide on-tech content for viewers to experience and enjoy the natures of national parks, such as healing camp, trekking, and VR-based activities. KMPS has created a smart work environment to respond to COVID-19. For the stable environment for work at home, we increased license, allowing staff to get the approval system at home. Lastly, KMPS checked if each response policies to contain the pandemic were well implemented on the site. Now I will present post-COVID-19 plans. Above all, KMPS will make strenuous efforts for innovative way of working. In terms of park use, we'll use VR and YouTube to develop nature interpretation programs for viewers to appreciate landscapes of national parks and get valuable information without visiting the park actually. For enhancement of park management, we'll use more digital devices, including AI and drones. KMPS plans to create National Park Healing Zone, which connects the park and the local community for the purpose of achieving economic, social, cultural, and environmental benefits. This is the end of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hee-Jin Kang, for that very informative presentation. Thank you again. Before we go on to questions, please save your questions for the question and answer session coming up after the next presentation. And again, please feel free to pose your questions in the question and answer, or sorry, the chat of this Zoom webinar. Next, we will have a short presentation from Mr. Ludi Apin, who is the Deputy Director at Sabah Parks. Mr. Ludi, the webinar is yours. Please, go ahead.
with me today, also my director, Dr. Maklarin Lakim, and I can see from the screen there are also colleague or fellow from Malaysia, like Dr. Victor, Dr. Rahim Masa, and I think if I miss something, they may also be able to help me answer some question from the participants. So during the COVID-19, I'm sharing now the Sabah Park's experience. Sabah Park is located in Sabah, part of Malaysia. It's situated in the island of Borneo. So at the moment, as the current statistic of COVID-19 for Malaysia as 23rd July, that is today, as you can see in the screen, we have much less, I think, far less than other countries. And I should be not so confident to say, but I think we are well aware of the impact of the COVID-19, and the Malaysian government has taken a serious and very detailed and thorough preparation on make sure the COVID-19 doesn't spread that seriously in Malaysia. So Sabah Park has nine parks altogether. It's not very large area compared to other countries. It's only 1.2 million hectare, 3 terrestrial parks and 6 marine parks. And this is the maps of parks in Sabah. And the lockdown so-called, but we call it restricted movement was imposed on the 18 March 2020, whereby the nationwide movement control order produced by National Security Council or Government of Malaysia, and followed by the movement control order issued by the state government of Sabah. And from that, Sabah Parks adopt and develop its own standard operating procedure within and entry to parks when we open. And then the action plan that we have done was very simple. Sabah Parks strictly follows the MCO or movement control order issued by the federal and state government. All parks were closed to public and visitors from 18 March until we opened it last 16 June 2020. Make sure that there is no spread of whatsoever we call pandemic or COVID to the wild or to the people that working inside the parks. And all parks officers and staff, other than the essential staff like enforcement, were ordered to work from or at home. And the mode of meeting via virtual teleconferencing was already in our kind of norms as of now, because we have been practicing this for the past 3 months. And as you can see in the picture, no visitors at all, so meaning no COVID-19 contact to the wild. Impact to the parks or Sabah Parks, the advantage were the parks area were relieved from stresses, all kind of stresses. Recuperation of the natural environment within recreational area was made possible. And we saw a clear sign of wildlife appearances at the recreational areas. We can already see orangutans nests, and see some wildlife appear. That means the recuperation is going well. And we also have ample time to do maintenance of the parks facilities during the COVID-19 movement control order. And we have more resources, staff, essential staff, to do active protection, monitoring, enforcement, and conservation of the parks. But of course, like the New Zealand and other part of the world, the disadvantage was loss of revenue. As of today, yesterday, approximately we have lost the revenue amount to 14 million or US dollar 3.2 million. And since the movement control order imposed on the 18th. So it's also a loss of public and visitors nature tourism and recreational opportunities, and also loss of others also. And then of course loss of income direct to 350 mountain guides and porters of Kinabalu Park, the mountain guides and porters, 13 villages that are associated with the parks in terms of community-based ecotourism activities. And we have 6 private resort operators that also has 0 income. And more than 20 diving operators operating at marine parks has no income from the tourists. Indirect, we have more than 70 tour guides that has lost their job. And we also have rated hotel 272 has no very minimal income. And then also the non-rated facilities like hostel, B&B, more than 300. And we have numbers of private and homestay nearby the parks that has no visitation or visitors or guests. Very minimal, 1 or 2, which cannot sustain their operations. But fortunately for Sabah, we are moving towards the green zone, meaning impact of the COVID has been call that a very minimal, I should say, under control, especially within the parks area. We have resumed our operation of visitors entry last 16 June. And then as you can see, we have an increase of visitors to the park. And with the proper standard operating procedure to enter parks, which also requires social distancing, as you can see from the picture on the right-hand side, there's a box that where the visitors should stand up while moving into the parks, and you can see the picture up there that everyone must use face mask to go into the park and also during social distancing. And as of my presentation, that is our experience with COVID-19. Thank you very much. That's all. If there's a question, my boss, Director Dr. McLaren and other fellow from Malaysia can also answer on behalf of me, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ludi Up, and thank you for that presentation and some interesting approaches that also mirror some experiences in Korea, in the Republic of Korea, for reopening of protected and conserved areas in Sabah. Now we turn to the question and answer session for this portion of the webinar. I just want to come back to our colleagues at KNPS and ask a question about the eco-healing zone. But firstly, let me say that what I took note of, and I found quite interesting from the presentation from KNPS, is obviously there are very comprehensive measures in place with KNPS for reopening the parks in terms of social distancing for visitors, procedures for visitors entering parks, and similarly, as I said, in Malaysia, in Sarawak, from Sabah Parks. However, what I did note also is that we all know that people enjoy visiting nature. It's good for their health. It's good for the economy. And so there is a lot of giving by protected and conserved areas in many different ways to the overall population of the globe. However, what I took note of is in the Republic of Korea that during this time, the KNPS and staff of the KNPS have a social contribution scheme whereby they're contributing also financially to communities around the area and also volunteering their time. I found that very, very interesting, a way of giving back also from KNPS to communities and to protected areas as well. But let me come to the eco-healing zone. That was quite interesting. You covered it briefly. Can you tell us a little more, KNPS, about the eco-healing zone innovation that you have brought to protected and conserved areas in Republic of Korea, please. There was the slide towards the end, just the second to last slide from your presentation about the eco-healing zones.
Yes.
Just tell us a little bit more about how they work and their purpose. That would be great.
In Korea, we have like a camping site and other recreational areas, but most of them was not much like not like something big buildings or big infrastructures. But recently, we got granted from the government that they can make something a bit big infrastructure, but which is a very environmental way, as you can see on the pictures. So not like just a small camp and a tent or camping site. As you can see in the picture, that could make some a bit bigger accommodations, something like accommodations. And as you can see, the picture under the lower picture, that you can experience the top of the trees. So we call it skywalk or something like that. Okay. So we didn't have much of infrastructures, but recently we started to establish some big infrastructures.
I see. It looks like it will bring certainly many jobs to the area and provide some, as you say, some connection between the park management authorities and local communities as well. This is a question from me to both the KMPS colleagues and to Sabah Parks, and that is, and perhaps Mr. Ludi, you would like to respond first, and that is how, as the parks have reopened in Sabah, how have you found the responses from visitors to all the measures that have been put in place for social distancing and other measures at the parks to reduce the risk of COVID-19? What has been the response of visitors? Mr. Ludi first, and then perhaps our colleagues in KNPS can also add to that.
Thank you, Alex. They have been very cooperative. Visitors are very much also aware of this COVID-19's pandemic's impact, as they were also having this 3 months restricted movement, and they can understand easily what's going to happen if they do not follow the standard operating procedure. So far, visitors in the park since opening, they were very, very cooperative, and they really support the parks what we have been instructing them to do as according to the SOP. Thank you. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Mr. Ludi. Colleagues from KNPS, can you tell us a little more about the response of visitors to the measures that KNPS has put in place for visitors to protected and conserved areas in Korea? Have people been mostly positive with responding to those measures?
As many visitors visit the visitor parks every day, and especially on the weekends, and they are always. We believe that the visitors, they have very much good understanding that we must keep the nature safe and for the future generations. As people understand the policy of the Korea KNPS, there were not much problem or conflict between visitors and Korean KMPS. So our policy that was initiated by KMPS. There was no resistance or any kind of conflict or problems. So we believe in the power of the people of Korean, and we are sure that another kinds of any kinds of the policy by the government could be easily implemented to the people. So there was no big problems.
That's great. That is great to hear. It's great to hear such positive news out of the Republic of Korea in this regard. Let me turn to another question that has come in. Another question that has come in over the chat line, and that is that have there been any parks that set limits on the number of visitors or the timing to facilitate the new norms on physical distancing and to prevent congestion in the parks? And if so, how has that been implemented? So have there been measures or limits to the number of visitors that can enter parks during since reopening? Perhaps Mr. Ludi, if I could call on you first.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Yes, we impose a limited number of visitors at one time. We have this average of 100 people. For example, like going into one of our parks, marine parks called Tunku Abdurrahman Park, we impose 100 packs of people, visitors a day. That's our limitation. But we will also look into day-to-day basis operation if the movement of these visitors are very much in control, and because in the parks there are few islands, and then we will look into day-to-day management of how to increase the number. But we have an average of each island 100 visitors per day. That is to ensure the social distancing is followed by the visitors. Thank you. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Mr. Ludi. And colleagues at KNPS, have there been limits put on the number of visitors that can visit, say, per day in parks in the Republic of Korea?
Okay, currently we haven't set any limitation on visitor number, but if the situation aggravates, we'll be initiating. We are thinking about initiating the limitation of visitors in the parks.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that response. There has been some, if you're following the chat of the webinar, there's been some discussion about ranges and have there been incentives provided to park rangers during the COVID-19 pandemic? And perhaps I can expand that question more broadly to the protected areas, protected and conserved areas, management authority, park staff, more broadly, not just rangers. But Mr. Ludi, has there been a decrease or a maintaining or an increase in the number of park staff at protected and conserved areas in Sabah during the COVID-19 period?
Thank you, Alex. The number of rangers of staff of the parks maintain the same. And as I have shown in the presentation, that there is a direct impact to the mountain guides, for example. We provide incentive to the mountain guides, although they have no job at all during the pandemic or control movement order. Sabah Park has made initiative to pay them accordingly to support them during the closing of the parks. And so as the community-based ecotourism village or the owners, we also provide incentive for them, or in short, we call it CSR to ensure that during the pandemic, they are not hardly hit by the economic downfall of during that time. So over to you again, Alex.
Thanks, Mr. Ludi. Colleagues at KMPS, before I come to Dr. Mark Hocking, colleagues at KMPS, has there been any changes in the park staffing in Korea during this time?
The number in rangers hasn't changed at all. It's steady still. So did I answer your question?
That is fine. It is good to hear that the park staff remains constant, obviously, at KMPS. So thank you for that quick response. Mark, I see you have your hand up. Please, can I turn to you?
Yeah, sure. Just the picture around the world is quite variable, particularly where agencies, and I'm thinking of some examples particularly in Africa, but also some from South America, where the agencies have depended on revenue from tourism. Staff have been put on furlough without pay. I know some examples from both government and private protected areas where staff have been put on 50% pay, and a number where they have no staff operating because they lack the resources. The estimates of how long, from the Africa survey, how long agencies could continue to function in the absence of tourism revenue. I don't have the figures directly in front of me, but from memory, many of the agencies indicated that they could only operate for 3 to 6 months, and after that they would have to be putting staff off. So I think that's one of the real dangers, that if in many cases they don't have a lot of alternative to that, and that's where I think the rescue component comes in. So whether that's what I think the sort of rapid response grants, where they exist, would go to do that sort of support. In the absence of that, I think we could see some real, not only the direct impacts on the staff and their families and so on, but also impacts on the park with removal of staff. It's good where governments have maintained it. In Australia, park staff have stayed the same, although their capacity to operate in many cases has been reduced, so that, for example, the work on monitoring and field work, some of it's been maintained, but in some cases that's also been reduced. So it's quite a variable and I think a worrying situation around the world.
Thanks, Mark. I see we have a question in the chat about, or actually a further comment in regards to that question earlier about rangers, that some parks in the region have deployed rangers to other duties, perhaps with other agencies, I suspect, on border control, and that's been a way to offset the income that they may have made from park ranger duties to taking on employment somewhere else. There was also a question from participants about a reduction in entrance fees for visitors entering into parks during the COVID-19 period. Ludi, did you want to respond to that specifically?
Yes, yes, Alex. We do impose as what do you call that? As approved by the government. We also impose a 50% reduction in general to all the visitors from when we opened last 16 June to the end of this year. And then we will have to revise that accordingly next year, depending on the situation of the pandemic in our country and especially the Sabah. Over to you again, Alex.
Thanks, Ruda. For example, in some countries, certainly here in Thailand, there are programs by the government to encourage domestic tourism as international tourism is is not currently permitted, but there are programs. There's actually a program that's just launched here in Thailand to encourage domestic tourism, with the government subsidising the cost of hotels and travel and things like that. And hopefully that will encourage, because many national parks are now open here in Thailand, that will encourage the domestic population to travel domestically and to visit national parks. I'm not sure if there's a reduction in the cost of entry to parks, but certainly there are programs to encourage domestic tourism, and that should get people out visiting national parks and conserved areas here in Thailand. We are almost out of time for the question and answer session, but if you do have a burning question, then please pose it in the question and answers in the next, in the chat in the next couple of moments. I'm just looking at some of the latest comments. There's a discussion going on around ranges still, but I think for the time being, we will close the question and answer session and bring the webinar to a close. In doing so, let me first thank our panelists in order, Dr. Mark Hawkins, the message delivered by Ms. Mariana Ferreira, the presentation by KNPS and Mr. Hee-Jin Kang from KNPS, and also Mr. Ludi Avan from Sabah Parks as well. Thank you all for your contributions and for your time today, contributing to this webinar on COVID-19 and protected areas, hosted by IUCN and APAP. I would like to thank, secondly, all the participants for joining us today and during this webinar, and for your time. And thank you for your contributions on the chat and questions. I hope our panelists and I have been able to provide some insight to those questions that you posed on the chat. And just to remind you that a short web story about this second APAP webinar will be published by IUCN on the APAP official website. And as I said earlier, that story will contain links to the presentations delivered by our panelists today. And I should also note that it's been raised a couple of times, I think it's been mentioned already during this webinar, that IUCN, the Asia Regional Office here, is currently carrying out a small study about the impacts of COVID-19 on protected areas management in order to develop a better understanding of the implications of the pandemic for conservation in the region. This has been done through a short questionnaire which has been circulated to government protected area agencies in Asia. We've already had many responses from across the region. And thanks to any of those that are on the webinar today who have provided those responses. And we will be collating responses after the close of the survey on 31st of July. And the results of that questionnaire will be shared with all organisations that have participated in the survey. And again, thank you to all that have provided inputs already. In closing, I'd like to thank Ms. Min Sun Kim for her excellent organisation of this webinar and all the time that she's put into preparing it with our panelists and with the team here at IUCN. And I'd like to thank our team who have facilitated the webinar today here in terms of our IT team. And in closing, I would like to reiterate something that Dr. Mark Hawkins said from his presentation, and that is that we need to find a new and transformative relationship with nature. We need to use this COVID-19 pandemic as a means to reiterate the importance of our relationship with nature and use it as a stepping stone towards a brighter future in which humans, people, and nature live in harmony. Thank you to you all, and good afternoon from here in Bangkok.